Welcome, everyone. This is Sciortino of Junction. We are happy to have today a new event on the series in collaboration with Mahidol University, particularly IPSR, the Center for Migration, and where I am also and this is the second event for this year, and we are going to talk with Ben Harkins, who is a technical advisor for the Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia program, who is a program focusing on migrants in the fishery in Southeast Asia, fishery and seafood processing in Southeast Asia. And he will tell us about a report which recently has come out, which look at the condition of migrants in the blue economy, the so-called blue economy. Ben, please, the floor is yours. You have about 20 minutes, and then we will open for question and answers.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Leah, and thanks to Junction and IPSR for inviting me to present today. So yeah, I'm going to briefly present some of the key findings from our new research study, which has been titled Towards Fair Seas, Recruitment and Working Conditions for Migrant Workers in the Fishing and Seafood Processing Sectors in Southeast Asia. This was a study, as Leah mentioned, conducted by the ILO Ship to Shore Rights Southeast Asia program, together with our partner Rapid Asia, funded by the European Union. So let's jump right in. Starting with some background, the blue economy has really been critical to the prosperity of Southeast Asia for generations. What we've seen during the last 30 years is that the labor force in the fishing and seafood processing sectors has shifted pretty dramatically. So migrants now fill many of these jobs because nationals don't really want to take them. They're viewed as low paid, demanding, and hazardous. So those are mostly jobs done by migrants at this point. And of course, at the same time, what we know is that there are research and media reports that have clearly shown that there are very significant decent work deficits in these sectors now that migrants are employed in them, and particularly major concerns with forced labor. So a lot of what's been emphasized to date has been the vulnerability of migrant workers in the industry specifically. But of course, we know this is a broader problem, and there haven't been regional studies conducted previously on that level. So to kind of fill that gap in knowledge, we did conduct a mixed methodology baseline study of working and living conditions for migrant workers in fishing and seafood, and this was done between May and July 2022. We interviewed a little over 1,200 returned migrant workers in Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So the idea was to interview them in a safe setting in their country of origin where they could speak freely about their conditions. We also did qualitative interviews with 24 returned migrants who showed indications of forced labor, as well as 16 key informants with tripartite plus stakeholders from government, from workers, from employers, from CSOs. So altogether, this is the largest survey of these issues that's so far been conducted in the region to date. So just to jump right in.
Sorry, Ben,
yes?
you have the notes open, visible. Maybe you want to adjust the PowerPoint.
Is that better? Can everyone see it now, or is it the notes still? Leah?
See the slide and the notes. But it's okay. Don't worry then.
Okay. Sorry about that. From my side, it is showing the presentation, so I'm not quite sure.
I'm sending you the photograph in your WhatsApp.
Okay.
Yes.
Um, should I go ahead?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Um, okay. So I wanted to start by sharing a quote on recruitment and migration processes from a representative of an Indonesian manning agency. And what they said was the recruitment costs for migrant fishers can vary widely, and they really depend on the destination country and the manning agency involved. Under law, agencies in Indonesia are not allowed to charge these costs to fishers, as they're supposed to be borne by the vessel owner. At my agency, we really don't charge fishers anything for recruitment, but I know that some manning agencies still do. Um, So looking at the migration corridors, most migrant workers were not able to select a specific destination country that they would go to because they weren't in a position to choose. Instead, they just kind of had to migrate to wherever there were jobs available to them. So if we look at the migration corridors for migrant fishers, nearly all of the Cambodian and Myanmar fishers were headed to Thailand. While we see for Vietnamese fishers, they were divided between the destinations of South Korea and Taiwan. We did see much more diverse destination countries for Indonesian fishers. They worked in Taiwan, China, Japan, and Korea. And in terms of the migration corridors for seafood processing, again, nearly all of the Cambodian and Myanmar migrants surveyed had worked in Thailand. And again, the destinations for Vietnamese migrants were quite a bit more diverse in seafood processing. So they had worked in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Here, I think, one of the emerging trends that we do see in the region is that Japan has really emerged as a key destination for many migrants in Southeast Asia. And it's largely because there are, higher wages paid for work in Japan, as well as increasingly a more liberal admissions regime there, although, of course, that has changed a little bit as of late. Um, so go to the next slide here. Um, it is not moving. Um, can everyone see that slide on recruitment costs?
Yes.
Okay. I don't see it, but I will go ahead. So under the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there's an indicator recruitment costs borne by employees as a proportion of yearly income. And of course, the target for this indicator is ultimately that we want to eliminate all worker-borne recruitment costs because, if there's a high ratio between the recruitment costs paid versus the salary earned, it signals, it does place a high economic burden on migrant workers. What we found is that the total average costs paid for recruitment fees by migrant workers was equivalent to about 3.7 months of income. And by far, what we saw is that the highest costs were paid by Vietnamese migrant workers who paid the equivalent of 7.5 months of wages to go to Korea, 6.3 months of wages to go to Japan, 3.9 months of wages to migrate to Taiwan. So, a key thing that we see here is, in fact, there are notably different recruitment costs being paid to go to the same destination countries and sectors depending on the nationality of the migrants. And what that suggests is that the regulation of recruitment agencies in these different countries of origin is vastly different, and it is really important that we work to ensure fair recruitment practices if we're going to reduce these costs for migrant workers. Okay, so moving on, although taking on, of course, some form of debt, it's very common for migrants. We know that migrants do usually pay some of the costs involved here in Southeast Asia. The financial pressures that are created by the need to pay back really excessive recruitment fees, can have a profound effect on their, freedom mobility. So what we found is that approximately 3 out of 5 migrant workers said that they had taken out a loan or had wage deductions made to pay for migration costs, whereas only about 2 out of 5 said, yeah, they could really afford to pay their recruitment fees out of pocket entirely from their own savings. And here, it's really notable that Indonesia, more than half of migrant fishers said that they had financed their migration through agreeing to pay their employers back through wage deductions after they started work. And, that may sound like not a bad thing, but if migrants have wage deductions, it is a particularly risky form of debt for migrant workers because it can easily transform into debt bondage if the employer doesn't handle those wage deductions transparently. So moving on again, we had a Myanmar fisher who worked in Thailand, who told us there were no fixed work hours. They just gave us signals when we had to work. If the fish were caught in the trawl, we had to jump into the water and drag the net into the boat. The rest hours were only about 2 to 3 each day. We only got to rest when there were no fish. If there were fish, we had to work. The next slide is about work hours. So what we know, of course, is that migrants in the fishing sector typically have to work long hours. It was an average of 14 hours per day, nearly every day of the week. And that would actually amount to 94 hours per week if a rough calculation is made. The work hours were much longer in the Taiwanese and the Chinese fleets. Fishers there reported 15-hour days, 105 and 101-hour weeks, respectively. So really excessive work hours in those fleets. What the findings suggest is that these problems with excessive work hours for migrant fishers, they're really widespread in destination countries across Asia. And what we did see, of course, is for migrants in the seafood processing sector, the hours were somewhat less. They worked an average of 9 hours per day, 6.1 days per week, amounting to approximately 58 hours per week. So they were working shorter hours, but even so, 58 hours per week, significant amount of overtime. And it may increase their income, but what we know, of course, is seafood processing workers, they tend to have to work these hours because if they don't earn enough income through overtime, they can't really support their families. And so the wages really need to be higher so that seafood processing workers don't feel forced into taking on these long overtime hours. Moving on, and again, I see the slides are not moving, so I'm sorry about that. I really don't know why. Wage theft remains one of the most prevalent forms of labor rights abuses against migrant workers. Some of its forms, these abuses are considered to be an indicator of forced labor. So migrant workers who are employed in sectors that are, excluded from full coverage by labor laws, and that does frequently include the fishing industry. they are particularly vulnerable to experiencing wage-related abuses. So overall, what we saw is the average wages earned per month by migrants in the fishing and seafood processing sectors was about 660 US dollars, but there was quite a lot of variance depending on the destination country involved. Migrant fishers and seafood processing workers earn the highest wages in more developed destinations, Korea, Japan, and much lower wages in Taiwan, China, and Thailand. If we make a rough calculation based upon the wages they were earning, what we see is, in fact, only about half of the surveyed migrant fishers in Thailand were earning at least the minimum wage. Whereas if we look at the wages in the seafood processing sector in Thailand, there was quite a bit of compliance. So almost everyone in seafood was earning the minimum wage. So big differences sectorally and nationally. The next slide is about occupational injuries requiring medical treatment. So work in fishing, of course, is recognized to be one of the world's most hazardous professions. And of course, accurate data is quite limited on work in the fishing sector. But there was a recent global estimate done which suggested there are somewhere around 100,000 fishing-related deaths in the fishing industry every year. And of course, we know, the safety and health risks in seafood processing work, they're generally considered to be lower than in marine capture fishing. But at the same time, there are still quite a few risks. In seafood processing, migrants are working in very cold conditions. There are slippery floors. They're working with heavy machinery in some cases. So they still do experience accidents and illnesses. What we found, overall is that about a quarter of migrant fishing and seafood processing workers experienced serious work-related injuries that required medical attention. And a big challenge here for the fishing sector is that migrants experienced injuries, but in many cases, they were not taken back to port to receive medical attention right away. We see a lot of challenges with skippers who want to continue fishing, continue earning income, even though they have had a serious accident on board their vessels. So this is a big concern. The other thing that we found with the survey is that there's really a clear correlation between working excessively long hours and experiencing serious occupational injuries. So migrants who worked, just 8 hours per day, only about 1 in 5 reported an injury. But if they worked 20 hours per day, nearly 2/3 reported experiencing an injury. So a lot of this is about the fatigue of working excessive hours. Moving on, so we have another quote about forced labor. A Vietnamese fisher who had worked in Taiwan told us, "I could not leave my job because they kept my salary. They only paid me $100 per month, and I was told the rest of my wages would not be provided until the contract was completed. Some of the other fishers asked to receive their salary so that they could change boats, but the vessel owner always refused to pay them. I really wanted to leave because the working conditions were terrible, but I knew I would not receive my wages if I did." To estimate the prevalence of forced labor in research studies, the ILO actually adopted new guidelines in 2018, which we did apply during this study. And based upon the definition in the Forced Labor Convention, the ILO methodology focuses on evaluating the two elements of involuntary work first, and then threat or menace of penalty for leaving the job second. So it's a case of forced labor if both of those elements are identified in the same reference period of employment. Of course, these are very complicated concepts. So we don't actually ask migrants directly, were you working involuntarily? Did you have a menace of penalty? Instead, we develop what we call indicators of these two elements of forced labor. And that's what we ask of migrants to determine if they are, in fact, in a situation of forced labor. So the analysis produced an overall estimate that 1 out of 8 migrant workers in the fishing and seafood processing sectors were employed in situations of forced labor. What we found, in fact, is that it's much more common among fishers at 20% than it was among seafood processing workers at less than 1%. So, of course, there is a highly gendered pattern of employment in these two sectors. Men are almost all the fishers in the industry, and seafood processing work is dominated by women. So there was a closely correlated difference in forced labor between men and women based on those two sectors. As well, when we look at the countries of origin, it was really Indonesian migrant workers who were the most likely to be employed in conditions of forced labor at 30%. And that was followed by Myanmar migrants at 10%, Cambodian migrants at 8%, Vietnamese migrants at 1%. If we look at the destination countries where they were actually working and employed in conditions of forced labor, Taiwan stands out with the highest prevalence at 25%, followed by 9% in Thailand, 5% in Japan, 2% in the Republic of Korea, who were in conditions of forced labor. In China, in fact, we didn't get quite a large enough sample to really convincingly calculate a prevalence rate, but the sample we did have, 28 out of 51 migrants did show indications of forced labor. So if that is broadened, in fact, it would be a very, very high rate of forced labor. So given that the cases of forced labor we identified, they were almost entirely in the fishing industry, we decided to do a deep dive analysis on the segments of the fishing industry that had the most substantial problems with forced labor. So what we found is that the prevalence among migrant fishers in Taiwan was the highest at 28%, followed by Thailand at 18%, and the Republic of Korea at 2%. Again, we didn't quite have large enough samples in China or Japan to calculate prevalence rates. But as I said, the sample that we did collect from China suggests there is a very high rate of forced labor in the Chinese fleet. We also looked at the types of fishing that was being done to see if there was a relationship to forced labor. And indeed, longline fishing had the highest prevalence rate of forced labor at 24%, followed by purse seine fishing and trawl net fishing. And this pretty much confirms what we already know. Fishing by longline tuna fishing vessels has been heavily associated with a greater likelihood of labor abuses in many research studies, and that's due to the arduous work schedules that are involved, as well as the very long periods of time at sea. And then finally, probably unsurprisingly, migrants who were on longer fishing voyages, they had a much higher rate of forced labor. So 1/3 of migrant fishers who were on vessels that were at sea for 6 months or more had experienced forced labor. So what we know, of course, is that barriers to pursuing redress, this is one of the key factors behind the vulnerability of migrant workers to abuses. The obstacles are often even more severe in the fishing sector because, of course, fishers spend a long period of time at sea. They often lack communications technology, and in some cases, there may be unclear jurisdiction over the abuses they're experiencing if they're, for example, working out on the high seas. So among the migrant workers who showed indications of forced labor, only 1/3 said that they sought assistance. And the most common reasons for not seeking help were not knowing who they could go to, not feeling that the problem was serious enough, language barriers, and most especially because they feared retaliation for making a complaint. We actually looked at who they went to for assistance, and what we found is Actually, most migrants just go to friends and family for informal support in these cases. It's really notable that migrants, they did not go to labor authorities, they did not go to police, they didn't go to other government officials in destination countries, who is really who they should be going to when they need formal assistance, and they didn't access those officials. So it really demonstrates there is a lack of trust in government support for migrants in these industries. Of course, when we look at whether they were actually able to resolve their cases, we did in fact find that more than half of migrants said that they did resolve the problem, but because of course they went to a very informal source of support, what they mean by resolution is probably very limited in scope. So maybe they got out of the situation, but the remedies that they received were probably quite limited. So one final quote here from an Indonesian fisher who worked in China. He told us, overall, I think my migration experience was negative, but I really did not have much choice. I had to work abroad because in Indonesia, it's very difficult to earn a good salary without more education. Had I known that I was never actually going to get paid what I was promised, I never would have left to Gaul. I spent 8 long years in the middle of the sea, and there was no one there to help me but God. Um, so in conclusion, I think we can see indeed, Thailand's fishing and seafood processing sectors, they've really been a focus for global concerns about the exploitation of migrant workers during the last decade. The problems paid to working conditions in the blue economy, I think what we can see from the survey, they're not misplaced, but it's not limited to Thailand. This is a much broader decent work deficit in the fishing and seafood processing sectors. So what the findings particularly highlight is the higher prevalence of abuse on distant water tuna fishing vessels in China and Taiwan. And here, of course, we know the excessive work hours, the long periods at sea, really heighten the vulnerability to coercion for migrants in these industries. However, I do want to stress here, none of the flag states that we surveyed were entirely free from cases of forced labor. What that suggests is that problems with coercive labor practices, they are really endemic to these sectors, and it's not just one country or another. In addition, we see the heavy reliance on women to perform low-paid, precarious, often very informalized work in the seafood processing value chain. It's really been pretty neglected in comparison to work in fishing. And most of the attention on the seafood processing sector, it's really focused on the traceability of the products involved and not so much on improving the working conditions for women in this sector. So what we see overall is, the scale of exploitation revealed by the study. It really clearly shows that these problems are not caused by a few kind of quote unquote bad apple employers and recruiters. It's not a matter of criminality so much. These are really systemic challenges for the industry. So in terms of what we can do to make the situation better, the key recommendations of the report are, first, to develop worker-centered approaches to private sector due diligence as an alternative to some of the corporate-led initiatives that we see really relying on top-down audits, third-party certifications that we know haven't proven effective in protecting migrant workers. The second recommendation is to ratify and fully implement the ILO conventions on recruitment, work in fishing, forced labor, freedom of association, and collective bargaining, so that we ensure there is this legally binding set of standards in place to protect migrant workers from abuses. Third, to improve enforcement by applying a multidisciplinary approach to inspection of fishing vessels and increase the effectiveness of inspections in identifying labor rights violations, promoting occupational safety and health. We know, in many cases, labor inspectorates are not even involved in inspecting fishing vessels. It's important that we not only look at the fish that are caught, but the workers as well on board these vessels. Fourth, we need to remove the legal restrictions to organizing and support workers' organizations to really take root and flourish, to start rebalancing the scales towards greater social justice for migrant workers in these industries. They need to have the ability to expand their worker power so that they can negotiate on an even playing field with employers. Fifth, enhance wage protections to protect migrant workers from what we know are some of the most common forms of abuse that they do face in these industries. That includes things like underpayment of wages, withholding of wages, as well as illegal wage deductions. And then finally, it's really important to transform the discriminatory gender norms in the fishing and seafood processing sectors. That includes, particularly for women, some of the gender wage gaps that they often experience, the lack of maternity protection for women that do become pregnant, as well as high rates of violence and harassment that we do see for women in seafood processing firms. That's it for me, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. So now we can see you fully. Thank you for this very comprehensive presentation. The floor is open for question and comment here on Zoom, as well as in the Facebook of Junction and IPSR. We have two first questions. One regards regional mechanism. So this is a lot of these issues are bilateral or even multilateral, include both Southeast Asia as well as East Asia countries. So are there mechanisms that can be used to address some of this concern? This is one first issue. Then the second issue is about the methodology. These are migrants interviewed after they arrived. I mean, they already had been migrants and they have returned home. What are the plus and minus of this approach?
Okay. Yeah, no, good questions. Thank you for those. Indeed, of course, we are a regional project. And so a big push that we've made is to have more regional engagement on protection of migrant fishers in the region. When Indonesia was chair of ASEAN, they actually led the process of developing what was called the ASEAN Declaration on the placement and protection of migrant fishers, as well as corresponding guidelines for implementation of that declaration. And I think that is an important initiative. I think, of course, there's always skepticism with respect to the degree that ASEAN instruments are going to be implemented in practice and what impact they have on the ground. But as a political commitment, this was an important step forward. And I think, what we are looking to support during this current phase of our project is sort of practical work planning, as well as further guidelines for ASEAN member states on how they can really implement some of these commitments in practice. As I said, of course, this is not a national issue, and particularly when you talk about fishing, it is inherently transboundary. So it's not really possible for one country in the region to respond to, all the problems we see. It has to be done, more collectively. And so it is really critical to have these regional coordination mechanisms to better respond to the challenges that we see in the industry. What we're working on during this phase, as well as the implementation of the commitments that ASEAN has already made, is to look more in depth at how labor inspection of fishing vessels can be improved. There are some mechanisms in place in some of the countries around the region, but as I said, it's quite limited. So what we want to see is more cooperation on inspection of fishing vessels throughout the region. And that includes both, when you talk about inspections, there's both flag state and port state inspections. So the flag state meaning, they are actually inspecting their own vessels that are flying their flag, but countries can also do port state inspections where they are inspecting the vessels that are coming to their ports to unload fish. That's an important gap within the region. That is basically not happening at all within the region. It's really important that states do take more responsibility for inspecting the vessels that are coming to port, even if they are not flying their own flag. So those are a few of the initiatives that we are trying to support at regional level to address some of these issues. The question about methodology plus minuses of interviewing returnees. This is actually a methodology that we've used to some success in the past, and I am a proponent of it. I mean, I think yes, the minus, of course, is it's a little bit of a detraction from the timeliness of what you are hearing from respondents. They're talking about experiences that happened a short time ago, but what we do is define a window of eligibility for the respondents. So they had to have returned within the last 2 years. So usually it's not a huge gap in terms of when these conditions actually occurred. And for us, in terms of accessibility, it is such a huge advantage because if you talk about interviewing migrants on fishing vessels in destination countries, that's extremely challenging to do. They often are, under the control of their employer, the skipper, the crew lead for the vessel. So it's hard for them to really speak freely about, what's happening for them. And particularly, if a migrant is in a situation of forced labor, it's very unlikely you would be able to reach them at all. So in terms of, ability to really allow migrants to speak freely about their experiences, I think that the trade-off with a little less timeliness in terms of what they are reporting to you, it's actually quite worth it. And we haven't really found problems with recall using this methodology. Migrants tend to remember very well what they experienced in destination countries.
Thank you very much. We have a question. Adjan Musika Wong, maybe you want to ask directly, or should I read it?
I think you can just read it. Thank you.
Okay. So we have a question actually two questions. Can you discuss more about why Indonesia has more forced labor and why Taiwan vessels? That is one question. And a bit more on how to develop worldwide supply chain responsibility in fair labor. I think this was quite a comment when you launched the report at Junction. There was a lot of discussion also about the whole issue of worldwide supply chain and the role of consumer. And so maybe you want to elaborate more on this.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. They are good ones. I mean, part of the challenge with recruitment in Indonesia, it is quite loosely regulated. So this is a huge part of the problem. There is a lot of deception during the recruitment process that's happening in Indonesia. Part of it is making sure that the mandate for regulating the process is clear. There is a lot of sort of shared mandate across Indonesian government agencies for regulating the recruitment process for migrant fishers. And it needs to be more clear. And of course, it needs to be more robust in terms of the regulation of those agencies. Often what we see is, yes, the bottom line is Indonesian migrant fishers, they do represent the largest portion of migrant fishers in the region, and they just don't know what they are getting into when they are recruited. So they need to be much better informed about, what their employment situation is going to be. And and the actual agencies involved, the manning agencies, need to be more tightly regulated. If we look at the destinations, yes, this is so it is a two-way street. It is the country of origin, but also the regulation that's happening in the destination countries. So in fact, it's not just Taiwan, it is China as well, as I highlighted in the research, where we see pretty substantial gaps in terms of the decent working conditions for Indonesian fishers there. I will say it is a much more challenging undertaking to regulate distant water fishing vessels. So when you talk about Thailand, this is primarily coastal fishing. They're not fishing uh, far out at sea on the high seas for months and months at a time anymore. That element of the industry doesn't exist anymore. So they are regulating boats that are coming into port fairly regularly, and they can develop inspection mechanisms so that they can see what is going on board those vessels. When you talk about China and Taiwan, if you're talking about a distant water longline tuna fishing vessel, they may not see those vessels more than once every 6 months, and that does have inherent challenges with regulation. That's not to say that both governments don't need to do more. Of course, we know particularly with the Chinese fleet, it is a fleet that is sort of oriented towards bulk mass fishing operations. They are putting a huge number of vessels out at sea, and there needs to be a much tighter regulatory regime in place to monitor them. I would say for Taiwan, in fact, quite significant efforts have been made to improve regulation in Taiwan. But again, of course, more work needs to be done so that those vessels are being inspected regularly, that workers are being paid their wages, that they can join trade unions, all the rights that are outlined in the laws in Taiwan, they do need to be better enforced, I would say. The question on worldwide responsibility is an important one. And I think that is increasingly being highlighted that, if there is what we see, this overall scenario of globalization, and you create a race to the bottom on wages and working conditions for where you are sourcing your fish and seafood products, that you're creating an environment that contributes to exploitation of migrant fishers and seafood processing workers. So buyers need to be accountable as well for not sort of undercutting the employers in the countries where these operations are taking place, so that they're not trying to source the absolute cheapest seafood products. They are, in fact, paying a fair price. They are, in fact, a part of making sure that there are responsible business practices for the enterprises working in these countries. And there is a lot of work being done on that. So particularly, of course, we've seen forced labor bans put in place in a number of countries, the US and now in the EU as well. Other countries are also discussing deploying similar kinds of bans on importation of products produced with forced labor, as well as sort of supply chain due diligence legislation. This is particularly something we're seeing the EU is working to develop. And what that will mean is that indeed there will be much higher standards for how these products are produced in source countries before they get to market states. So that is an important mechanism. The other thing that we see increasingly is that labor standards are being built into modern free trade agreements. So particularly if you look at the EU-Thailand free trade agreement that's currently under negotiation, a key point that's being raised by the EU is we do want to see compliance with international labor standards in Thailand where we're sourcing our seafood and fishing products. We want to know that migrants there can unionize. We want to know that they can bargain collectively. We want to know that they're going to be free from forced labor. So there are these mechanisms that are being brought to bear to advocate for higher labor standards through trade agreements as well.
Forgot to unmute. We have so many questions now that we need to.
Maybe I should go faster. Sorry.
Okay, and but I think that you have a lot to say. So let's start from Jessica. She has 4 questions. Basically, they're all focused. I will summarize about. She wants to know more about the ship to shore program. Can you provide some example of concrete work? Who are the partner? In particular, she's interested in the partners in Indonesia. And what are the biggest challenge that you have addressed with your program? I think I am summarizing here, but actually there are 4 detailed questions you can see in the group. Then we have 1 question about, can you please elaborate more on the measure practice that can contribute to reduce rates of forced labor? For instance, the South Korea model here is mentioned as a possible example. Compliment for the very interesting research about Taiwan. Are there migrants from Cambodia? If they are, the words I use here are regulated or unregulated, documented or undocumented. And last but not least, given the relatively high prevalence of occupational injuries, how were these injuries measured in the research and classified? And could there have been factors such as self-reporting, recall bias, or limited access to medical care? Could have this influenced this estimate one way or another, less or more?
Okay.
Okay, I think this is the last round of
Okay.
questions.
Okay, thank you for the questions. It's great to have so much interest. I probably can't present the entire ship-to-shore rights model briefly, but essentially, yes, we work across the region. We have particularly country-focused programs in Cambodia, Myanmar, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Indonesia. And we really work in 4 key areas. So the first objective is around, as I mentioned earlier, regional cooperation on improving working conditions, sustainable fishing practices in the fishing and seafood processing sectors. The second one is about improving national legislation and enforcement. The third one is around private sector engagement on improving, business practices in these target sectors. And the fourth one is actually about empowering migrant workers directly to be able to assert their labor rights. And this is particularly through organizing, but also through what we call migrant worker resource centers, who provide direct information and services to migrant workers. This is a UN interagency project, so it is led by the ILO, but it is implemented together with IOM, who does a lot of trafficking, return and reintegration related activities, as well as FAO, who does a lot of work on sustainable fishing practices, climate change mitigation for the fishing industry. So that is it in a very small nutshell. In terms of the partners for Indonesia, we have a lot of them, of course. Indonesia is a key country of intervention for us. In terms of our partners running MRCs, right now it is the Indonesian Migrant Workers Union, SBMI, who delivers the direct assistance to migrant workers. We also have quite a bit of work in Indonesia on joint inspection of fishing vessels. So we work with the fisheries ministry as well as the labor ministry, so that they work together jointly on inspecting vessels at provincial level. So that's a big partnership for us. We also do, quite a bit of work on advocacy. So we've been working extensively with a whole range of trade unions in Indonesia, particularly around advocacy on ratification of the Work in Fishing Convention C-188, which has proven very fruitful. We are expecting within the next year, Indonesia is going to make significant moves towards ratification of the ILO Convention on Work in Fishing. So those are a few of the key partnerships. There are many more, but I probably don't have time to go into huge detail. In terms of a model for reducing forced labor, yeah, this is a challenging question. From the ILO perspective, I think what we advocate is really a structural response. So there's no magic bullet here. It is really about improving labor rights, working conditions, broadly speaking, and that is the way in which you address issues of really severe labor rights abuses like forced labor. So it does include prevention. Prevention is a key mechanism for forced labor. Migrants need to have labor rights so that they can avoid situations of forced labor. It does include prosecution of cases of forced labor. So if an inspector finds a case of forced labor, the responsible employer needs to be held accountable for those abuses. We also do a lot of work promoting access to justice and remedy for migrant fishers. So they need to be able to raise complaints when they do face abuses, as well as, get responsive remedies. So, not just punishing the perpetrators involved, but they need to get the wages that they were due. They need to receive all of the benefits that they should have received from their employment that they did not receive because they were in a situation of forced labor. So that is kind of it in a nutshell, but it's basically a broad structural approach to improving working conditions, not only specifically looking at addressing cases of forced labor. That is what the ILO advocates for. In terms of Taiwan and whether there are Cambodians working there, not that I am aware of. A lot of the fishers in Taiwan are from Indonesia, of course, but also the Philippines. There are quite a few Filipino fishers there also. I believe there are some Vietnamese fishers there as well, but to my knowledge, I don't think there are many Cambodian fishers. Cambodian fishers tend to work in Thailand because of the proximity. As well, we do see some Cambodian migrant fishers in Malaysia as well within the region. So those are two of the key destination countries for Cambodian migrant fishers. I'm sure there are others, but of course, the fishing industry, in many cases, because the migration process is so informal, so irregular, there are no sort of perfect statistics in terms of where migrant fishers are going throughout the region. In terms of the reporting on occupational injuries, yeah, I mean, of course, there is the potential for some biases here. These were self-reported injuries, and we know that's at the moment probably the best way to go about collecting this data. The official channels for reporting of injuries in fishing often are quite limited. So that means the data coming in really does not reflect the scope of injuries that are occurring. This is one of the most hazardous forms of work in the world. And when there are, in fact, deaths, those deaths are usually reported. But if you're just talking about sort of an injury that requires medical attention, they don't always report these kinds of injuries when they come back to port. So that kind of data is quite hard to come by. So yes, I mean, there is some subjectivity in terms of what migrants were reporting to us as an injury that required medical attention. But that said, I think, if you're looking for a source of data on migrant injuries in the industry, this is probably the best source you can come by at the moment. So thanks. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Ben. Very comprehensive and on time. So I think we are finishing. We have shared the report in the group, and we are also share some information about the ship to shore program that we have taken from the ILO website. We have not made it up. But Ben, of course, you are welcome to add if you have further material later on. We can always share on our website and Facebook group. So thank you for all those that have followed us, and also thank you to my colleague at IPSR, particularly the Mahidol Migration Center, Ajahn Musika Wong, and the team. And also thank to Shamil, Vanessa here at Junction, which has organized this particular session of our series. We will be back again. The plan is to have every 2 months Wednesday seminar focusing on migration as part of this collaboration. So thank you again, everyone, and to the next one. Bye. Thank you, Ben.
Take care.